Year 11 and welcome to OCR History B, the Elizabethans 1580 to 1603. This content video will focus on theme 3, which is daily lives. Start by having a look at lifestyle and just a reminder of the Elizabethan hierarchy. So we had the labouring sort at the bottom of the hierarchy, the middling sort, and then we have the gentry. So to start off with the labouring sort, it made up about 50% of the population, and the vast majority of these people worked in farms, and they work on the farms of the middling sorts. They are working for the people higher up in the hierarchy. They worked very long hours, and there were some who were vagrants. And vagrants, remember, are people that wander around with no fixed home, looking for work. So they will go from farm to farm throughout the year. It was treated very harshly, but this didn't deter people because of the fact that they needed money. The labouring sort tended to live in cottages, which were small and poorly built. They had no upstairs and no chimneys, and they had no glass windows as glass was so expensive. They had just 2 rooms with a bare earth floor, so very, very basic conditions, and life would have been difficult for the labouring sort. The main part of their diet would have been bread or vegetables. So you will remember, I'm sure, from lesson that we've discussed pottage, which is like a vegetable stew. And these would have been made using vegetables from the garden. Very occasionally, they might have had access to eggs, cheese and beer, but generally speaking, we're talking about bread and vegetable soup or pottage. And bad harvests had a huge impact on the lower classes. So, for example, in 1594, the prices rise massively as a result of the fact that there is very little produce going around. So that means, obviously, the less you have of something, the more valuable it becomes. And this means that the vast majority of people cannot afford a good diet. We end up with a middling sort then, often lived in towns as tradesmen and craftsmen, and they owned their own businesses. So these people were making much more money than the labouring sort. If they were living in the countryside, then they were known as yeomen, and these farmers employed labourers and husbandmen who were small farmers who paid rent to farm the land. So this was if they were in the countryside. They would have more comfortable housing, so living on 2 floors with a fireplace and glass windows, so those things that the labouring sort couldn't afford. Their houses had a hall. They would have had parlours with living and sleeping rooms and chambers. So they did eat well, but not ceremoniously. So what we mean by that is they didn't have particularly exotic choices of food, and they didn't have the feasts that the upper class would have had, but they did eat much better than the labouring sort. They didn't have imported fruits, and they drank beer, not wine, again because wine would have had to have been imported. And some of them had servants, and they would have eaten with them. And we then have the rich or the gentry. So gentry homes were surrounded by gardens, orchards, estate farms, and this meant that they had lots of food available to them that they could literally grow on their estates. And their homes really reflected their wealth, and they were based on the Renaissance period. So these homes were very, very luxurious and very grand. The gentry had a diet that was made up of things like beef, pork, venison, goose, swan, pheasant, lots of wine which could be imported, and this is because of the sheer amount of wealth that the gentry had. Food was often served in great ceremony with servants and guests, and they would feast all day. This was a real entertainment thing to do, really, for the wealthy, to put on a feast and show off the wealth that they could afford. Wealth that they had often came from the ownership of land. So although the gentry only made up 2% of the population, they owned over 50% of the land. So that would be a good statistic to remember for the exam, which really reinforces the wealth of these individuals. Quite often they were JPs or Justice of the Peace, and they enforced the Queen's laws in Parliament. So they would be very powerful individuals. And it was very, very difficult for a middling sort individual to make the move up the hierarchy into the gentry. That didn't really happen. The Elizabethan hierarchy was pretty static. People didn't move about. So if you were in the gentry, the likelihood is you would obviously stay there, and there's not going to be people particularly moving into that social class. Our family life then, we're going to start off by looking at marriage. So young people married when they could afford it or when the woman became pregnant, and this was 30% of marriages. So at the time it would have been unacceptable to have a baby out of wedlock, and this is why so many women would have been pregnant at the time of marriage. Men tended to marry in their late 20s and women in their mid-20s. As wealthier couples could afford it, then they would get married younger. There is a restraint on wealthier couples which would have been quite trying at the time, and this is that they needed parental approval of their spouse to ensure that their assets were protected. So remember, we said on the previous slide that there wasn't really any fluidity to move up the hierarchy. So if you're a member of the gentry, you would have only wanted your child to marry within the gentry, and this really means that the parents decide who you marry. So if we're thinking about life being perhaps more challenging for different groups, you could speak about wealthier couples having a harder time because their couples needed to approve who they married. In terms of gender roles, there were very clear roles for men and women. So in the middling and poorer households, wives would help their husbands with work. It was the man who owned the property, and divorce was very difficult as it needed an act of parliament. But people could separate informally, and they did so. In terms of children, families were small and children grew up quickly. They were expected to live the lives of adults at a very young age. A quarter of children died before 10. Obviously, this was partly as a result of the lack of scientific understanding at the time. They were expected to work at 7, which reinforces the point about growing up quickly. And only the rich or the gentry went to school. From the age of 13, poorer and middling children left home to become apprentices or servants. So your childhood in Elizabethan England would have been very, very short. And finally, in terms of households were mainly nuclear, so relatives were often in the next village or town due to teenagers leaving home, and very rarely would family live abroad. So this is our overview then for family life in Elizabethan England. We have the issue of poverty. So in terms of long-term causes, England's population has doubled from 2.4 to 4.1 million during the Elizabethan period. So this would obviously have huge implications in terms of there not being enough jobs, there not being enough food. Remember, the less there is of something in society, the more expensive it becomes. So the fact that there isn't enough food for people means that rising prices are applied to food. And this, combined with poor farming techniques, means that food becomes very, very expensive, and the labouring poor really do struggle to support themselves during this time period. We've also got low wages given as competition for work due to the population increase meant that employers could offer lower wages, and there would be a labourer willing to accept them because there was now a surplus of workers. In terms of short-term causes of poverty, we've got the harvest failure in the 1590s. Remember, this means there's less food available, which means the price increases. And we've got a downturn in the cloth demand in the 1580s, which leads to vagrancy. We then have the government reaction. So they were more worried about the threat of the vagrant poor than helping the settled poor. So vagabonds or vagrants were seen as criminals, and in 1572 there was a law that stated they could be burnt through the ear, so they were visibly being marked as a vagrant, or they could be hanged. And there was a 1589 law that made it illegal to shelter vagabonds, which really does reinforce how much of a threat they were seen. So towns then had to deal with what were known as the settled poor, and they encouraged people to provide a poor rate. So this is where the gentry and the middling sort had to pay a local tax to provide for the poor. They gave 3.5 pence to the poor each day. The able-bodied poor, so people who could work, were given wool and they were paid to spin at home. And those who refused would be punished in workhouses. And then we see the poor put into categories of the impotent poor, so that would be disabled people, able-bodied poor, those who could and were willing to work, and then we've got the vagabonds, who are the people who were wandering around the country looking for different jobs. So as a result of the worries of poverty and the government reaction, we end up with the Poor Law in 1601, just 2 years prior to Elizabeth dying. So because the problem of poverty was huge by the 1590s, Elizabeth felt that she had to act. So JPs, or Justice of the Peace, appointed overseers of the poor to collect the poor rate. And this was collected, as we said, from households that could afford to pay it. Begging was forbidden. Vagrants were whipped and sent back to their original villages. So we've got harsh punishments again, hoping that this would be a deterrent to vagrants. We've got the impotent poor, so what we would know as disabled people who were looked after in almshouses, which were kind of like caring facilities mixed with hospitals really for people that needed support. Work was given to the able-bodied poor, as we said, things like being given wool and asked to spin at home. For those who were claimed to be work shy, so those who refused to work, would be sent to houses of correction, and this is where they would be punished really for refusing to work and taught skills to enable them to work. It did not solve the problem of poverty, but it did provide a safety net and ensure that some would survive bad harvests. And for the first time, we see some responsibility on a national level of looking after poor people. It was now down to the state, not neighbours and the community, to look after one another. So this is a huge turning point really in policy. This is a national law that Elizabeth introduces in 1601 and deals for the first time with poverty. And it shows that taxation could be used to help others. So the daily lives topic is a little bit shorter than the ones previously, and the ones that will follow are a little bit longer. So our next topic is going to look at the theatre and Elizabethan enjoyment.